Absolutely. All right. Thank you all for continuing to be here this afternoon. We just have our last set of concurrent panels this afternoon. In track one, we will have Dr. Jonathan Purtle presenting on dissemination to policymakers. Dr. Purtle is an associate professor in the Department of Public Health Policy and Management and director of policy research at the Global Center for Implementation Science at the New York University School of Global Public Health. He's an implementation scientist whose research focuses on mental health policy. His work examines questions such as how research evidence can be most effectively communicated to policymakers and how it is used in policymaking processes, how social and political contexts affect policymaking and policy implementation, and how the implementation of policies on the books can be improved in practice. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Purtle. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Let's set my timer here. So I'm Jonathan, and my work focuses on the dissemination of research evidence to policymakers and also the implementation of public policies on the books. So my burning research question and kind of what got me into the area of implementation science is this question of how we take high quality, policy relevant research evidence and get it into laws on the books so it's not just sitting on a shelf or on a server. And I found that implementation science has been a really kind of useful space to secure funding to do this sort of work, a space that offers frameworks and ways of thinking that have been really complementary to these sorts of questions. So first, this big picture, kind of my appraisal of the field of implementation science, and my research, again, being at kind of the intersection of dissemination research and public policy. So when we look at the field, we have a lot more implementation research than dissemination research. And I'll give a concrete definition of dissemination on the next slide, but really it's about the packaging and communication of research evidence to different audiences. And in my case, my audience is policymakers, mainly at the state level in the United States, whereas we have a lot of implementation research. Also, when we look at implementation science and the different levels or settings in which work is being conducted, we have a lot more at the clinical level, some at the organizational level, and really just a teeny bit focused at the policy level. So really trying to figure out how we can use communication and dissemination tools and strategies to shift policy so that they're more aligned with the best evidence about what's going to be the best from a public health and health equity perspective. So what is dissemination research? So this is per the National Institutes of Health. Dissemination research is the scientific study of the targeted distribution of information and intervention materials to a specific public health or clinical practice audience. The intent is to understand how to best spread and sustain knowledge and the associated evidence-based interventions. So again, dissemination is really about communication. It's about communicating research evidence to different audiences. Whereas implementation, on the other hand, is really more about changing practice patterns and changing behaviors. And of course, we want to disseminate well because we ultimately want to change behaviors, right? We want policymakers to introduce and support and pass legislation that's aligned with high quality evidence. Those are the behaviors we want to change, but to do that, often we first have to change things like knowledge and attitudes, and we can do that through dissemination. Dissemination research provides an empirical body of evidence to inform how we best can communicate research evidence. So D&I is often used to express dissemination and implementation in the field. I would argue that D*I is probably more appropriate in the sense that if we disseminate well, it kind of cultivates an environment and a sense of a state of readiness in which implementation strategies, which are more focused on behavior change, may be more effective. So what I'm going to present today is this three-phased approach for dissemination research that colleagues and I have developed. And all of our work in this space, most of our work is focused on policymakers. So I'm going to draw from that work presenting today and give examples of research and also kind of thinking that can be applied to practice across these three different dimensions of formative audience research, audience segmentation research, and then dissemination effectiveness research. And we spell all this out in this article. If you're interested and if you have trouble accessing it, please shoot me an email. I'd be happy to send you a copy. So in this domain of formative audience research, the goal is to generate data and information to inform the design of dissemination materials, say what's in a policy brief, how it's presented, and how they're distributed or sent to different policymaker audiences. So there are at least 4 things we want to assess within this domain of formative audience research. So we've looked at and tried to understand what are policymakers' awareness or knowledge about an evidence-supported policy or the problem, the health problem that that policy addresses. And I think that last part is really important because oftentimes as researchers, we come in with solutions to issues that policymakers don't even perceive as problems, right? They don't know about it, don't know enough about it. They don't have a full grasp of the issue. So first we have to kind of raise their awareness of the issue and kind of its different dimensions. So just an example from our work, this is from a survey of 475 US state legislators. There's a large body of epidemiologic evidence saying that indicating that different adverse childhood experiences are pretty strong risk factors for mental health and substance use disorders in adulthood. And here we just wanted to get a sense, do legislators understand that? Do they get that? So we had them rate on a 5-point scale the extent to which they thought that each one of these ACEs was a major risk factor for behavioral health issues in adulthood. Here we dichotomized it, and we kind of see this breakdown. And this signals, okay, for issues like childhood sexual abuse and physical abuse, they kind of get it, but much less so for witnessing domestic violence, childhood neglect. So perhaps when we craft policy briefs about these issues, we want to include evidence about those issues being risk factors because a large body of evidence says that in fact they are, and we want legislators' knowledge to be aligned with that. Also in this domain, we'd like to get policymakers, get a sense of their attitudes towards different sorts of policies, specifically policies with a pretty strong evidence base. So here, Everett Rogers constructs. Everett Rogers developed the diffusion of innovations, which is a pretty well-known social science theory. He has these constructs such as relative advantage and complexity, kind of different dimensions of the thing that you're disseminating about, in this case, some sort of evidence-supported policy, and what policymakers think across these dimensions matters and might affect their support. So example from this same survey. So here the thing, the evidence-supported policy we were focused on was state behavioral health parity laws. So these are laws at the state level that really require insurance companies within the state to offer equal levels of coverage for physical health and mental health and substance use issues. And we wanted to get a sense of legislators' attitudes towards these laws and their knowledge about the laws. So we wanted to know, do they think that these laws increase access to behavioral health treatments? And evidence says that they do. And most legislators got that. But evidence also says that these laws don't really increase insurance premium costs. And here we see a disconnect, legislators not really getting that. And also because of these laws, which we defined for legislators in the survey, what they do is they increase access ultimately to mental health and substance use disorder treatments. We wanted to know, do state legislators even really think that these treatments can be effective, or are they worth something? And here we found surprisingly low levels of knowledge or beliefs about the potential effectiveness of these treatments, signaling, all right, maybe this is something we want to focus on in our dissemination work. Also, we want to get a sense within this domain of policymakers' support for the specific policy that you want to see adopted or adopted at a larger scale. So here, these are the same variables down along the bottom. So we asked legislators in the survey, how much do you support state behavioral health parity laws as we define them on a 5-point scale? So here we dichotomized it. Did legislators say 4 or 5 on the scale? About 40% of them did. And then we looked at the extent to which these different beliefs and attitudes were associated with support. And we do this because it gives us a sense of what sorts of attitudes we might want to target and change to subsequently change and increase support for state behavioral health parity laws, the evidence-based policy that we want to see adopted at a greater scale. So here we find this belief that laws increase access to behavioral health treatments being independently associated with support, signaling, all right, when we craft policy briefs about state behavioral health parity laws, maybe we really want to emphasize some evidence about how these laws increase access to treatments. And finally, within this domain of formative audience research, getting a sense of the extent to which policymakers and different types of policymakers want to receive information about the policy or issue. So asking them, what do you want a policy brief? What source do you want it from? Who do you trust? What mode of delivery do you prefer? Do you prefer emails? Do you prefer webinars? Do you want somebody to have a conversation with you? What are your preferences? So again, examples from US state legislators and also state mental health agency officials, directors. So those being executive branch policymakers, more administrative than elected folks. And we asked them, if you were to receive a policy brief about behavioral health issues, how important would it be that it had each one of these different attributes? And as you can see, information about budget impact, cost effectiveness, really at the top of the list here, signaling to us, all right, let's make sure that we can tell a story in economic terms sometimes, if possible, to give legislators what they want from disseminated evidence. So next domain, this bucket of formative audience segmentation research. So audience segmentation research seeks to understand how dissemination materials might be tailored or differed strategically for different groups within a larger target audience. So say different types of legislators within a target audience of all 7,300 US state legislators in the US. So audience segmentation is really a standard practice in marketing and advertising and health communication, where you're trying to change people's individual health behaviors, like get people to stop smoking or exercise more, things like that. And the general premise is, within your larger population that you're interested in influencing, there's a lot of heterogeneity within that population in terms of individuals' knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors related to an issue. So audience segmentation is really an analysis approach that seeks to identify discrete subgroups that have similar characteristics. And by understanding that, we can think about how we tailor our dissemination strategies and materials for different groups, as opposed to a one-size-fits-all communication or dissemination approach. So there are two broad types two broad ways of doing audience segmentation. Demographic separation is what one's called, and the other is called empirical clustering. So in demographic separation, it's what it sounds like. So you have some data about your target audience that's relevant to your dissemination question. And what you do is you just stratify that population based on some demographic variable, something you know about them, using demographic pretty broadly. So here again, it's these attitudes or beliefs about adverse childhood experiences being risk factors for behavioral health issues in adulthood. And here we just stratify our data by the ideology of the policymaker. So we ask them about their social and their fiscal ideology at the end of the survey. We calculated a score for each legislator, and then we put them in a category that corresponded with their score. And here we see these significant and pretty large differences across the ideological spectrum, signaling, okay, maybe we need to do a better job communicating this evidence to conservative legislators. And with that, we should be thoughtful and thinking about frames and words and kind of communicate this evidence in a way that resonates with a more conservative worldview, as we see here from these data that the belief that these issues are risk factors is less prevalent among that audience segment. So the other approach, empirical clustering. So here, instead of just stratifying your data by a single demographic variable, you're using something like latent class analysis or k-means clustering, an approach to see how different variables hang together and kind of in a constellation or pattern to identify somewhat more sophisticated profiles of different groups within your target population. So here we did this, we used latent class analysis, and again, this data set from 475 US state legislators to identify audience segments that vary in terms of how they think about mental health and substance use issues. And again, the whole point of doing this being to inform how we might tailor dissemination materials and strategies for legislators across these different groups. So in our analysis, 3 groups emerged. So it's kind of fun. It's it's a quantitative exercise of running your code, and you get your fit statistics, and the models kind of tell you how many segments fit best, so on and so forth. And then it's sort of this qualitative exercise of looking at patterns across the different groups and coming up with names for each of the different groups based on their most salient features. So our 3 groups here, we came up with this group of budget-oriented skeptics with stigma, the passive supporters, and the action-oriented supporters. And I'll just walk through this a little bit more. So this first group of legislators, the budget-oriented skeptics with stigma, the largest group in our sample, we call them budget-oriented because above and beyond legislators in these other 2 groups, you can see the largest proportion of this group cared a lot about the extent to which a bill was going to impact the state budget, more specifically a behavioral health bill, when deciding whether or not they were going to support it. That's why they're budget-oriented. They are skeptical about the potential effectiveness of mental health and substance use disorder treatments. So as you can see here, much smaller proportions of legislators in this group thinking that these treatments can be effective, signaling, okay, with this group, this is something we really might need to convey through our dissemination materials to move the needle on this belief here. And we also find that this group has the most stigma towards people with mental illness. So we asked 4 items about stigma. In our survey, we calculated a score for each legislator and then put them in the quartile that corresponded with their score in the distribution of our sample. And as you can see here, a much larger proportion of legislators falling into these top 2 quartiles. This next group, the action-oriented supporters. So they're action-oriented because this is the group that was most likely to have introduced a bill to address mental health or substance use issues. Not surprisingly, this group also cares a lot about mental health and substance use issues. They're high priorities for legislative action in their state. And this group also says that they care about evidence when deciding whether or not to support a behavioral health bill, which is a promising finding. And lastly, this group, the passive supporters, they're passive because they're not really introducing bills to address mental health and substance use issues, especially substance use bills. They also care about evidence. And the supporter aspect, kind of the most salient feature of this group actually has the most faith in the potential effectiveness of behavioral health treatments. So here we see 3 distinct groups. In reality, we could probably group the action-oriented supporters and passive supporters to get together and give them a pretty similar policy brief. But you can imagine with the budget-oriented skeptics with stigma, we might give them a very different policy brief, right? One that's very careful to not amplify stigma towards people with mental illness and be very careful in the words and frames that we use, really emphasizing economic evidence, emphasizing the potential effectiveness of treatments and things of that nature. And lastly, this bucket of dissemination effectiveness research. So here the goal is to really do head-to-head comparisons and figure out which dissemination strategies are more effective than others, often and typically using some sort of randomized control design and doing really A/B comparisons. Begs the question of, well, effective at what? What sorts of outcomes should we be thinking about in dissemination research, and more specifically in policymaker-focused dissemination research? So one thing, you can do surveys, and we've done this. You disseminate, you randomize, you disseminate different types of policy briefs, and then you have policymakers complete a brief survey, answering questions about the policy brief itself, which you could embed in a web-based survey so you know they're seeing it, support for different policies, attitudes, all of that stuff. Of course, the only challenge there is getting a strong response rate from policymakers, which can be quite challenging. An alternative or additional approach is to randomize, disseminate, and then look at what policymakers do, which is often a more effective strategy because you don't have to worry about the response rate aspect. So looking at indicators of engagement with dissemination materials, looking at things like email open and link click rates. There are many ways to do that using marketing and advertising industry practices. Looking at artifacts of policymaking processes, so public statements of legislators, looking at their social media posts, what is said in legislative committee reports, and comparing differences in, say, the volume or content of legislative discourse about the issue you're disseminating about across the different study arms. So just an example here. So this is from a study we recently wrapped up. So here, what we're disseminating about, again, is evidence about adverse childhood experiences being risk factors for behavioral health issues in adulthood. And what we wanted to tease out here was how much does it matter if you include economic evidence, and how much does it matter if you include state-tailored data? So if you are disseminating to a legislator in Colorado, you include Colorado prevalence data about the issue and Colorado level economic impacts, economic evidence as opposed to national evidence. So we had 3 arms here. We randomized each state to one of 3 arms. So it was cluster randomized. And then all legislators within the states were sent these policy briefs via email from me. So this is all from a university researcher, which is an important kind of contextual element of the study. So our outcomes, we looked at email view rates. We looked at link click rates. So the policy brief was embedded in a link within the emails. We were able to track link clicks. All the emails concluded with a request for consultation from me to talk more about the evidence. So we tracked those as an outcome, those requests. And then we also looked at differences in Twitter and Facebook posts and mentions of adverse childhood experiences and related terms in legislators' newsletters to constituents and bills sponsored across the 3 study arms. So that was the field experiment aspect. So all of those outcomes were just observed and very pragmatic. Then we also did a web-based survey experiment at the end of that period where we recruited the legislators and their staff to complete a survey. We showed them the policy brief we sent right at the beginning of the survey, and then they answered questions about it and support for different policies, etc. So what did we find? We found that our hypotheses were sort of true. We thought that the state-tailored data and the economic evidence would perform better than the control. We found a main effect that was significant and pretty substantial for email views. But what was really interesting when we stratified our results by the political party of the legislator we were disseminating to, we found that our result was only significant among Democrats, that our intervention had no effect on Republicans, which again signals potentially the importance of tailoring dissemination materials for different types of legislators. And last example here, a study that I did with colleagues at Washington University in St. Louis, including Doug Luke, who I know is presenting a few times as part of this conference, where we developed an agent-based model to simulate the impact of knowledge brokers on the use of research evidence, and more specifically, the passage and adoption of an evidence-supported children's mental health policy within a state agency. So all the work I presented prior mainly focused on state legislators, elected officials, generally policymakers that don't have a lot of content expertise on mental health issues. Here, shifting over to the executive branch of government, folks in state mental health agencies who have content expertise. So just real quick, how we set this agent-based model up. So an evidence-based policy proposal entered the agency, was introduced, say by an advocate or a researcher to somebody working within the agency. And each one of these policy proposals across different runs of our model varied in terms of how costly it was. Some of these proposals were pretty cheap and a good deal, so that might be like a negative one, and other ones would cost a lot of money to do. They also varied in terms of contextual alignment. So the extent to which the proposal was aligned with the mission of the agency, with the needs of the people the agency served. And the evidence-based policy proposal also varied in terms of the strength of its evidence. And we had an aggregate policy quality score, which was kind of an average across those 3 different dimensions. We picked those 3 different dimensions of cost, contextual alignment, and strength of evidence from a bunch of surveys we did with these policymakers and also interviews we did with them to try to get a sense of, what influences support for a policy when it's introduced. So in this agent-based model, there are different policymakers, there are decision makers and non-decision makers, and each person within the agency varies in terms of how much they care about or how much they weigh cost, contextual alignment, and strength of evidence, which kind of aligns with reality, right? Some people care more about cost than others, some care about more than evidence more than others, so on and so forth. And lastly, each person within the agency has what we call alpha. That's the extent to which they're able to be influenced by other people in the agency who they talk to. So we have these decision makers, let's say they're orange, and non-decision makers within the model, and they're all connected within a social network, and they're talking to each other. And as they're talking to each other, they're rubbing off on each other. And over time, their level of support for this proposal, evidence-based policy proposal, is changing. It's going up or down, or it may be remaining flat. And what we do is we looked at what happened over time. And after a set amount of time, which would hypothetically be about a year in our model, the agency decided to adopt the policy. And they did that if 80% or more of the people in the model supported the policy. Reject it. I think that if it was only or less than 20% supported it, or take no action, which is in between and kind of similar to reject. It's less active, but they're still not adopting it. And we looked at just, if we send the policy brief to different people, let's say a decision maker versus a non-decision maker, does the time to decision speed up? If we change the dynamics of the social network and connections, does time to decision speed up? Playing with it in different ways to try to stimulate and get a better sense of how decision-making works within these agencies, and thus how we might better disseminate evidence. And then what we modeled ultimately in the end was a knowledge broker intervention. So we put a new person into the model, into the social network, who really cared about strength of evidence. And then they rubbed off on the different people they spoke to, and that kind of changed things within the network. And I just offer this as kind of another example of how we can think about and use different research methods, here system science methods, and specifically agent-based modeling, to generate an evidence base that can inform how we disseminate, hopefully, more effectively to policymakers. And this is just an example of a dashboard that the team at WashU made, where we can manipulate these different parameters and see what happens. And just a concluding thought, and then we have a little bit of time for questions and discussion. I should say this at the beginning, but I'm going to say it at the end. All that I presented, I have no belief is going to transform policymaking, right? Policymaking is extremely complex. It's inherently political, and that is not going to go away, right? But I think how we disseminate evidence to policymakers is something that we can do better. I think often we craft policy briefs and kind of dissemination strategies just based on anecdote and what we think is going to make the most sense. And I would argue that we can use data and a systematic research approach, at least to some degree, to improve our dissemination and make it more effective and better align research evidence with policy. So thank you for listening. Here's my email address. Please feel free to reach out with any comments or questions. And we've got a few minutes to chat if there is time and interest. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Purtle. I really appreciate your presentation. We have about 10 minutes for questions.
Thank you for that, Jonathan. That was a really interesting presentation. I just was interested in your views, given at the end with the ABM, you were showing the impact of different individuals on the uptake or the dissemination process versus just the different legislators overall. And for those of us who maybe wouldn't have be able to collect or collect as much information about the policymakers we're trying to disseminate to, do you think it's better to take an approach that just targets the information based on collectively that legislator, what their views are? Or is it better to know that individual who might be a gatekeeper, what their particular needs are and make it individual given they change? And what's your view?
Yeah, great question. And of course, it comes down to what's feasible and pragmatic, right? So I wouldn't say, right, I would not say do nothing until you're able to collect some data and have this rich information about different individuals. I think there's a good bit of theory out there and prior research from myself and many others that can inform decisions, and not everybody is going to go out and, of course, collect their own information. So to your question about kind of gatekeepers, or we can call them opinion leaders, key people, I think that's really important to keep in mind, and it's important to identify who those people are, which you could do systematically, looking at bills introduced, social media stuff, or you could just do it less systematically and talk to people and find out who is kind of the gatekeeper for certain issues, who's prioritizing them. I think it makes sense to go after them, if you will, and disseminate to them. But of course, they are operating within a context, right? And within a social environment. So I think also getting a sense of, who their connections are to, whose opinions they may care about, kind of who is in their network, and trying to influence those folks as well. Also, I would say across the board, both elected and administrative policymakers, they care about what their constituents, the people they serve and the people they represent, they care about what they think, and they care about what they want. So I think we can also think about how public opinion and influencing public attitudes can kind of be a precursor to changing policymaker attitudes and behaviors as well.
That's a really interesting point that you made at the end there, Jonathan, that there's potentially an indirect route to changing policymakers' minds by communicating to their constituents.
Sure.
And if something that the public is demanding, that then what the policymakers really care about is getting reelected.
Yeah.
And so how do you get to them indirectly to get support for their policies is through their constituents.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that, you know, in quote unquote policy focused dissemination research, it also makes very good sense to think of the general public as an audience you want to disseminate to and influence. It also makes the case for doing studies of how different health issues are being conceptualized in the public domain. So we've done news media analyses about different issues, because we know that news media shapes public conversation and opinion and how people think about issues. We've done public opinion surveys about different issues. And we do that through an implementation science lens. We conceptualize that as understanding the context, kind of the outer context of policymaking, and this understanding those dimensions. And then we could use that to leverage our dissemination efforts, or if not directly leverage it, at least account for it by understanding the context.
All right, anyone else have a question want to put in the chat?
We have a verbal question from Dr. Lee, if you'd like to go ahead.
Oh, hey, thank you. I just want to find out from your expertise working with policymakers, the examples you use relate to two generations, such as adverse childhood experience, and also those challenging issues like mental health, substance use. So what's your strategies to framing your message to engage policymakers? This is my first question. The second question, in your working on this area relating to, I guess you heard about transdisciplinary public health law research, legal epidemiology. So who are your partners from those expertise working with you on evaluating the impact of public health law, disseminating the key message, because the unintended impact of, you know, unprofitable law available here right now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Great questions. So your first question about kind of two generation approaches and adverse childhood experiences and what we've learned. I could talk a lot about that. I'll say the most important thing we've learned through public opinion experiments we've done, and we think we don't have reason to believe that these results wouldn't apply to policymakers as well, is I think we have to be really careful when communicating evidence so that we're not producing a lot of parental blame and stigma around childhood adversity and child maltreatment. So we just wrapped up a project that the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation was kind enough to support, where we kind of investigated this question of how do we communicate this evidence about adverse childhood experiences and then being risk factors, so kind of elevating the severity of the issue, but at the same time, we don't want to result in, you know, parental blame and stigmatization and kind of these unintended messaging effects. So we did some experiments testing different sorts of messages, and we found that some of the messages that cultivated the most policy support also produced parental blame. So we were still figuring out how we can kind of walk that line to elevate the importance and severity of an issue, but not having unintended messaging effects. And in terms of the legal epidemiology stuff, that's great. I'm glad you brought that up. We've kind of brought that into our work in a couple different ways. One is we've looked at laws on the books as kind of contextual factors surrounding legislators, the same way we've looked at and thought about public opinion research. So what are the laws on the books? What laws are being introduced right now? And how might we use that information to better understand context? And also, as kind of outcomes in our work, we've reviewed bills introduced in state legislatures, searching for specific terms related to what we've disseminated about to see if we see any traction and legislative activity around those issues. So I'm not trained as a lawyer, but I've been able to kind of develop enough kind of methodological savvy to do pretty basic legal epidemiology. I think when you get into more complex stuff, you need like a real lawyer on your team who understands nuances of statutes. But we found I've done a few public health law trainings, and they've been very useful, and that's a kind of a method that we've integrated into our work.
Thank you. Very helpful. I really appreciate your leading this important work, building those teams together, working together. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. That was really great. And I'm not sure if you were able to attend any of our earlier sessions, but very much in line with the tone of the conference so far. So thank you so much.
Awesome.
We
Thank you for
have
having me.
about a 4 or 5 minute break, and then and if you want to switch rooms, you have time to do so. And then we'll have the second of our concurrent sessions getting started in just a few minutes.